Welcome everybody. You'll see a map of both the Black Sea, Constantinople, the Crimea, and then there's a bit more detail to the right. And the reason I'm showing the map is that the Crimean War actually took place in the area of the Crimea, although it was actually fought in several other places, Alaska for instance, the Baltic. There were several naval actions in the Baltic, and there was skirmishes all over Europe, but they were really only skirmishes. And as I say in my talk later, to save you staying here all night, I'll just concentrate on where the main actions took place. One town which is supposed to be mentioned, or which I will mention, but is not on the map, I didn't notice until an hour ago, is Varna. Varna is here. It was a small town on the banks of the Black Sea. It had a natural port, and it's where, when war was declared, the Allied fleets decided to sail. They were actually standing off Gallipoli, where it was decided that that's where they'd camp, and they very quickly realised Gallipoli wasn't a very good place. Well, it's funny that. So did somebody else sometime later. So they waited in the Sea of Marmara, and then when war was declared, they sailed through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea and settled here. And they were there for a short while before they then went to Sevastopol. The Crimean War. I'm not sure why I chose the Crimean War of 1853 to 56 as a suitable subject for a talk. I think it's because I've heard it referred to as the first modern war, and I was curious as to why it would get that title. Secondly, Victorian England, although in the process of becoming the world's largest and wealthiest empire, completely bungled its military contribution to the conflict with heart-stopping incompetence. That was interesting too. Tales of incompetent leadership, ghastly problems of supply and poor planning in the Crimean War by all the participants abounded in many textbooks that I picked up and on military strategy, and stand out as examples of how not to run a war. That too was interesting. Were there any lessons learned? One particularly pitiful report that I read of years ago is of British soldiers in the muddy trenches shivering and starving in a Ukrainian winter. And we should know what that's like just by watching the news. Shivering and starving in summer uniforms in a Ukrainian winter, making their way to French lines to trade the boots and pieces of uniform of their comrades who had died of neglect and diseases for bread, while their officers lived in complete comfort. Lord Cardigan, the famous Cardigan of the charge of the Light Brigade, yes, his jacket was called a cardigan, for instance, retired to his luxury yacht every night. During the campaign, many of the senior officers went back to England for long breaks if things became too uncomfortable, like the freezing winters. Medical attention and sanitation was woeful, and it was only when this became known by the publics in France, England and Russia that things began to improve a little, although not through government policy but civilian intervention. And there's the famous report of a shipment of boots from England. British boots were pretty terrible anyway, but this ship only had left boots. Another item of interest to me was the current possibility that the Crimean Peninsula may again erupt in war. It's the weak underbelly of Putin's Russia, and if Ukraine can hold the Russian army in the Donbass, which it's more or less doing, it may be able to mount a Crimean offensive centred around Sevastopol. And the reason for that is that it's already sunk most of the Russian ships there. I suppose the last comment would be I found information on the war hard to access and contradictory, and that the war, although concentrated in the Crimea, was fought in the Baltic, the present-day Romania, Alaska, off the coast of Denmark. So you weren't there all night, I concentrated on the Crimea bit. What made the war a modern war? Europe had been at peace more or less since 1815, and in the intervening years many technologies and weaponry had become available, although it has to be said that most armies and navies remained conservative in their approach and did not always take advantage of new developments. Steam-powered armoured ships, mines and torpedoes had appeared, along with railways, telegraph, early breech-loading ordnance, armour-piercing and explosive shells, rifles with ranges out to 400 metres, replaced close-range flintlock muskets. Now, I don't know if any of you ever fired a flintlock musket, but if you can hit anything bigger than say a fairly large life-sized target at 40 metres, you're doing well. But the guns that I'm talking about are really based on, let's say, the Enfield 1853 Enfield rifle, firing a French mini ball. Most soldiers were tested and could hit a man-sized target, most of them could, at 270 metres, which was a big improvement on a smoothbore musket. These rifles were still muzzle-loading, although workable breech-loaders with a higher rate of fire had already been developed. I know of a double-barrelled shotgun with cartridges, breech-loading of course, very, very similar to a modern shotgun, was actually designed and built and used by a gunsmith called Pedot in 1812. And he was using detonators, not percussion caps, and he was also using smokeless powder, not gunpowder. But Napoleon and everybody else more or less disregarded these huge advances. Photography appeared to record the war and inform publics of the participating countries. Several studies, mainly French, with their history of reforms during the Napoleonic Wars had been conducted on the organisation of military forces. The resulting doctrines, including the importance of staff work, detailed planning, organisational structure, logistics, dedicated experts in the gathering and use of intelligence, and most of all, dedicated officer training and promotion on merit, were not widely adopted by other nations, to their detriment. France was definitely ahead of all other armies in 1853. The Crimean War commenced on the 16th of October 1853, when Russian troops occupied the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, now in Romania. Now that's here. This area here were the Danubian provinces, and the Russians came in from the north and stayed along the Danube, and when Russian demands were not met by the other parties, the war took place down in this direction until the Russians eventually withdrew. And they were nominal Ottoman protectorates, which meant that they were under Ottoman rule, and they paid a levy to Constantinople, but their administration was really Russian. So that's what a protectorate was. And ended on the 30th of March 1856 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Russia withdrew to the pre-war boundaries, and the Ottoman Empire limped on, inefficient and riven with dissent, more or less intact until 1918. The war, as is often the case, was the result of the machinations of individuals. Louis Napoleon, leader of the French, he looks impressive there, but he was a fat man with short legs, and he was intelligent, but he was certainly not material to be the dictator of France. He was just as egotistical as his grandfather, though. Oh, sorry, his uncle. Louis Napoleon, leader of the French, Nicholas I, Tsar of all the Russias, and an extremely able career diplomat, Stratford Canning, Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, British ambassador to the Porte, the accepted name of the Ottoman court, of Suleiman Abdülmecid I. Abdülmecid I was a young man at the time, and he was a reformer, and within the structures of court procedure and feudal culture, he had succeeded in his lifetime in partly reforming much of Turkey's government and civil administration, including the army, but he just managed to scratch the surface. Napoleon is largely credited with starting the war, but I don't agree. After his election in 1850, he had dispensed with representative government in 1851 after a successful coup. He probably Trump's read about him. Almost immediately, he cast around for an issue that would unite the predominantly Catholic French behind him. He chose what seemed to be an insignificant issue as to which branch of the Catholic Church should control the key to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. That's still fought over as to who should have the keys, But the Orthodox Christians, technically speaking, don't have the key, but they've got the key to a side door. So it's the Latin Catholics that have the key to the front door, but fights still break out between them, particularly over Easter. Nicholas I had become Tsar after the death of his father, Alexander I, in 1825. He was he was over 2 metres tall, powerful man with a commanding presence and a good intellect. He was the most reactionary of all of the Tsars, ruling through an inhumane police force called the Third Section, sounds chilling, which ruthlessly crushed any dissent. He was no reformer. Under his reign, Russia remained backward. Few roads, only one railway line, outdated agricultural practices, a cruel feudal system, and a completely corrupt aristocracy in government. The Russian army was untrained and badly equipped. And one of the reasons it was badly equipped was that as soon as equipment was issued to the soldiers, the officers sold it all off, kept the money. The Russian army was untrained and badly equipped. However, he was, in 1853, highly respected as the most powerful ruler in Europe. The Crimean War exposed Russia's internal weaknesses and destroyed Russia's reputation as a world power. I think Nicholas started the war. He had ambitions to destroy the weakening Ottoman Empire, what he called the sick man of Europe. He's the one that coined that phrase. And to pick up most of the pieces around the Black Sea, including Constantinople, thereby giving Russia warm water access to the oceans of the world. England was particularly concerned about that because their route to India went through the Mediterranean, and they didn't want Russians in the Mediterranean. They still don't. His concern over a breakup of the Ottoman Empire where Russia could be at disadvantage was justified. Ibrahim Pasha, the Khedive of Egypt, had declared Egypt independent in 1833 and had then moved to take Constantinople, which he could have taken but for the Russian intervention. Greece declared independence in 1827. Serbia fought a successful war of independence in 1829. So you could see all of these nationalistic movements occurring within the Ottoman Empire. He knew that the structure was poor, and he knew with the breakup that the European powers would descend on it, and he probably wouldn't get what he wanted, which was warm water ports in the Mediterranean. Stratford Canning, or Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, the most capable British ambassador to the Porte, and of whom it was said knew more about Turkey than anybody else of his generation, manipulated everybody involved, as well as Prussia and Austria. Now, Prussia and Austria come into this because after the Congress of Vienna, there was a concord set up of Prussia, Austria, Russia, England, France, and they virtually acted as the committee of Europe to actually administer Europe, settling all disputes, tidying up trade agreements and that sort of thing. So manipulated everybody involved as well as Prussia and Austria, both in front of and behind the scenes. He's quite unscrupulous. Given the ponderous communication of those days with his masters in the Foreign Office, he had become used to acting on his own initiative, and few diplomats before or since have believed more sincerely in the divine right of ambassadors. In the case of the Crimean War, he often acted completely outside his authority, making unofficial foreign policy for the four powers, often without them knowing it. The events leading up to the declaration of war are somewhat Byzantine, so I will keep them short. Stratford did try to broker a solution to Russia and France's competing claims of the protection of the Eastern Christians, and almost succeeded in getting Nicholas to modify his ambitions to break up the Ottoman Empire. Britain at that moment did not wish to see Russian expansion and was unwilling to involve itself in a war. Its government was weak and divided on the question, and in any case the military were not ready for a war. Its army was small, under-equipped and under-trained, and its senior command structure had not seen a war for 40 years. It had only a rudimentary logistic and supply system, completely untested. The Navy was somewhat better off, but it too had been neglected by successive governments, and was not as modern as it could have been. It had, though, been largely converted to steam power, and in the fleet that actually ended up sailing through the Dardanelles of some 400 ships, only 2 had to be towed, though there were sailing ships. Nevertheless, Stratford personally believed that Britain and France should support Turkey against Russian pressure to gain access to Constantinople, the Dardanelles and the Mediterranean. He therefore manoeuvred British policy towards supporting France and for France and Britain to support the Porte against Russian policy. Consequently, when Nicholas mobilised an army of 150,000 and moved into Moldavia and Wallachia, you might remember that, to enforce his demands over the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, he found Turkey, followed a bit later by France and Britain declaring war against him. France in this conflict was by far the most advanced army of the war. The Revolution and Napoleon had ensured the promotion of officers on merit. France had established, unlike Britain, officer training establishments. Soldier training was well organised. The French army had recent experience in Algeria, North Africa. Their initial commander, Marshal von Jacques, was a political appointment but an experienced soldier and a good administrator. He died of cancer in the Crimea and his place was taken by General Canrobert, another capable and experienced soldier. The French sent 65,000 troops. Lord Raglan, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, at 65 years old, which was old for the time, actually it's old at any time, but it was old at that time, was famous for starting his career in the army with a purchased commission. Actually, he purchased several through his life. And having never commanded anything bigger than a brigade, and that was in peacetime. However, he did have organisational ability and had been Wellington's military secretary from 1815. He lost an arm at Waterloo until 1852 when the Duke died. He cared deeply about the welfare of his men and was fearless and hard-working, and that will come out later. He understood strategy, but not the logistics of a modern army. He died in Crimea at the end of his conflict. It was said of a broken heart, but certainly full of regret for the way his army of 30,000 had suffered through his poor decisions and his gross neglect of logistics. Publicly, he was blamed for the many shortcomings of the campaign. Amongst his final words, he said, "I cannot return home. They would stone me to death." And he was probably right. The public outcry against him and the government was immense from about 1855 on. The Turkish army was led by Field Marshal Omar Pasha, 47 at the outbreak of war. He was a Serbian, but he'd served in the Austrian army. Accused of embezzlement, he fled to Turkey, converted to Islam and joined the Ottoman army, where he had a successful career within the empire. He was an excellent strategist. Thanks to reforms early in his reign of his sultan, he had a relatively well-organised army with a workable command structure, good training and relatively modern equipment, particularly artillery. And the Russians too, the only branch of the Russian army that was any good was the artillery. Even he, though, could not overcome the rampant corruption of the government, which limited the effectiveness of any reforms. It should be noted that the Ottomans had a long military tradition. Its empire was founded on military conquest. Although military power had declined since the days of Suleiman the Magnificent, you might remember I was talking about that with the Siege of Malta of 1565, in the 16th century, he nearly got Vienna. It was only the winter where the Turks had to withdraw from Vienna. The Ottoman military was still formidable. In the first action of the war, an 80,000 strong Russian army under the command of Field Marshal von Paskevich, a competent, experienced career officer, and General Michael Gorbachev, not Gorbachev, Gorbachev, came from the north and quickly established themselves along the Danube in the Danubian provinces. The Ottomans responded, resulting in the Battle of Olatina, which the Russians lost. The campaign seesawed to and fro with brilliant actions on both sides, But eventually the Ottomans, with Austrian help, forced the Russians to withdraw completely from both provinces. Half the Russian army, though, died of disease. It was 40,000 died, which is an example of the lack of sanitation and medical care that characterised the armies of the day. The next action was naval. In late November 1853, a small Russian naval force came across the Ottoman fleet in the harbour of Sinope. Sinope is on the southwestern coast of the Black Sea. That's it now, and the older looking buildings are parts of the original fort. It was actually quite heavily fortified, under Russian control, of course. A small town of 10,000 on the south side of the Black Sea. After calling for reinforcements, the Russian fleet slipped into the harbour under the cover of a fog, drew up beside the Ottoman ships, and over the space of 4 hours sank them all, with modern ordnance and explosive shells. It was reported that the Russian gunners went on pounding the Turkish ships long after they had ceased to resist, causing many unwarranted casualties. An estimated 3,000 Turkish soldiers died that day, compared to a few hundred Russian. Britain and France finally declared war. This act of wanton Russian aggression was too much to ignore. After the sinking of the Ottoman fleet in Sinope, the French and British fleets, which had then been waiting in the Sea of Marmara and toting some 400 ships of various types, all steam-driven but for 2 sailing ships, steamed into the Black Sea in early June 1853 to land the Allied expeditionary force at Varna. Then some of the fleet, steam warships in particular, sailed on to bottle up the Russian fleet in Sevastopol harbour. The Allied fleet then controlled the Black Sea for the rest of the war. Varna was a small port on the western coast of the Black Sea, chosen for its proximity to the Dardanelles and also to the Danubian provinces, where the Allies could assist the Turks to push Russia out of the provinces. For instance, the Russian army had laid siege and outnumbered a Turkish stronghold along the banks of the Danube, Silistra, which was in marching distance of Varna. Now a picturesque city in Bulgaria on the Gulf of Varna, of some 300,000 inhabitants and home to the Bulgarian Navy, in 1854 it was a small provincial port town of 10,000 inhabitants surrounded by fertile farmland. Within a couple of weeks it hosted 80,000 troops and more than 300 ships lay at anchor in the bay. Its facilities and surrounding villages were completely overwhelmed. Tent cities spread out over the rolling hills adjacent to the town. Sanitation, the provision of accommodation, fresh water and supplies immediately became a problem. And then came the news in late July 1853 when death and disease, due to a lack of sanitation and medical facilities, were sweeping through the town, villages and camps, that the Russians had withdrawn to the Crimea, mainly positioning themselves around Sevastopol, Russia's heavily fortified black naval base. A decision was made to move the fleet and troops to the Crimea and attack Sevastopol. The move was dithered, of course. Everything seemed to be dithered in that war. And Varna was not evacuated until September. 10,000 Allied soldiers, meantime, had died of disease in the meantime without ever having fired a shot. The Allies had already surveyed the southwestern coast of Crimea. They did that in Lord Cardigan's yacht, in great comfort. And apparently they sailed under the guns of Sevastopol's harbour, and they all saluted each other and sailed on. The Allies had already surveyed the southwestern coast of Crimea and landed at Kalamata Bay, and it came to be appropriately named because it was a calamity, just north of Sevastopol, and quickly that morning attacked a 38,000 strong Russian army deployed to meet their advance on the banks of the Alma River, a big creek with 3 to 5 metre high sides. As you can see, it's not a very big river, but it does have high banks on one side. And on this side, your left, the Russians deployed their guns, their artillery, some 100 pieces of artillery. The Russians had mounted 100 guns on the south bank, which they used with devastating effect. Russian artillery was the strongest part of their army. This was the first time the new French and British rifle firing the mini ball was used in other than a minor skirmish. It outranged the Russian muskets by at least 250 metres, probably more. There is a record of some shots being taken and was successfully fired from 400 metres. Russian soldiers and gunners were picked off at a distance. The French also turned the Russian flank by crossing the river and coming up behind. They crossed the river in the top of the picture and came up behind the Russians. The Russians did not believe that anybody else would do that they were attacking the whole army in front of them. By the time hand-to-hand fighting took place, the Russians were severely demoralised as well as being outnumbered. Raglan's decision, and they withdrew. Raglan's back into Sevastopol. Now, Raglan's decision not to follow is probably the most controversial decision of the war, certainly the most controversial decision of his career. It's now accepted by history that Sevastopol, had they followed the Russian army in, could have been taken that day, ending the war and avoiding the 362-day siege that killed at least another 300,000 troops. Raglan, with his advice from his official advisor Sir John Burgoyne, now decided to attack Sevastopol from the south and established at Balaclava a small coastal village with a good anchorage. Most of the fleet, some 400 ships, moved there and the troops marched their way south. Balaclava had no facilities and quickly turned into a squalid, disease-ridden cesspit, particularly when in the grip of a freezing Crimean winter. No attempt was made to build a proper base. The siege of Sevastopol commenced with guns of all sizes being brought up to pound Sevastopol to a ruin. The Allied navies pounded Sevastopol from the sea. To protect against a landing from the sea, the Russians moved the ordnance from their dozen or so ships and then sank them in the harbour mouth as block ships and sowed a line of mines to further discourage the Allied fleet. Interestingly enough, what they used in their mines was nitroglycerine, not gunpowder. And the mines were very effective. They did sink several ships. In answer to the bombardment from the sea and land, the Russians replied shot for shot, and both sides settled down to a mutual martyrdom in misery and squalor. The Battle of Balaclava was fought on the 25th of October, the beginning of winter, against the Russians outside the town, when they were attempting to assault this important Allied supply base. It's probably best remembered because of the incidents in the war, mainly to Tennyson's famous poem, and also what became known as the Thin Red Line. At the start of the battle, a large contingent of Russian cavalry charged the 93rd Highlanders. The men held the Russians off with well-aimed volleys from their Enfield rifles, scoring hits out to 300 metres, and they forced a Russian retreat. That's probably pretty much how it looked. Although I wouldn't like to be the guy out the front. Soon afterwards, more Russian cavalry were routed by the Heavy Brigade. Lord Lucan, observing the battle from 1,000 feet up, actually he was behind the Russian lines. He certainly was fearless. That's the valley of death into which rode the 600 afterwards. And I have no idea where the guns were, but my guess would be that they would have been behind this rise here. What a desolate bit of country. But you can see all the cannonballs on the ground. Now, they were being fired into a massive charging cavalry. How anybody survived is quite beyond me. From 1,000 feet up, actually behind the Russian lines, he was fearless and gave his confusing order to the Light Brigade to stop the Russians taking away Turkish guns that the Russians had captured, and leading to a charge up the Wrong Valley, which lost half the brigade. Cardigan later, sitting on his luxury yacht, yeah, that's one of the pictures he commissioned, had a picture done of the charge showing him out in front of the charge. Not true, of course. During the charge, he was tucked down one side, so he had people all around him protecting him. And he wasn't touched, nothing. And he rode through the Russian guns and pulled up and turned around and simply trotted out of the valley, and the Russians let him go. I suppose he expected that nobody would fire at an English gentleman who had just performed so bravely. The Russians retreated back to Sevastopol. The Allies did not have enough men to follow up, having been badly mauled in the battle. Well, everybody was badly mauled in the battle. The beginning of November saw the Battle of Inkerman, a Russian offensive outside Sevastopol, resulting in another Russian defeat, and the siege of Sevastopol continued. As winter set in on both sides, operations ceased. In early January 1855, an Allied naval squadron sailed into the Azov Sea. If you're looking at a map of the Crimea, there's a little sea up the top. That's called the Sea of Azov. To impede the communication and supply lines supporting Sevastopol. They ruthlessly destroyed nearly all of the Russian depots, towns and villages that were useful to the Russian supply line, and Russian naval power ceased to exist, and supplies to Sevastopol were severely curtailed. This action, although well thought out, was nevertheless long overdue, because the reason that Sevastopol eventually fell was the fact that they ran out of supplies. Back in Balaclava, public opinion, fuelled by the contemporaneous drawings, the new medium of photography, and dispatches from the Times correspondent exposing the shocking conditions under which the British, indeed all troops, to a greater or lesser extent were existing, inadequate clothing, rotten starvation rations, no medical care, the cold and the lack of fuel, inadequate shelter, most tents leaked, was resulting in private organisations filling the gap in the Army's administration of the war. I think that's quite odd. Things must have been really desperate, and the public must have been really pissed off with their government. A private company laid a telegraph, improving communication with London and Paris. Food donated by the public began to arrive in quantity. Private field hospitals staffed by volunteers and supplied with donated medicines appear. Volunteer engineers began to improve the appalling sanitation in and around Balaclava. Clothing was donated. Balaclavas and cardigans appeared. All of this was too late for many. At least 80% of the deaths and disablement of this war on all sides were caused by disease and neglect of the basics. Cholera, typhus, typhoid, dysentery, influenza, frostbite and starvation killed far more than shot and shell. Largely due to the efforts of the public and Florence Nightingale's brilliant administration and advocacy from her rundown hospital in Scutari, some modicum of medical care began to emerge. And she was given, well, as I go on to say, she was given no resources virtually at all. She arrived in Scutari, the place was full of rats, fleas. It was actually built over a sewer. And she decided that all of the wards should be cleaned, but there was no soap, no water, no brushes. She was supposed to have a shipload of all of those things that hadn't arrived. But she was up against the leaden military bureaucracy which starved the process of reform of staff, supplies and money. Russia and France also began to pay more attention to this aspect of the war. The Russian royal family in particular started to organise medical attention for their soldiers. So, it was a general realisation of everybody who became aware of what was going on in the war as just how desperate the plight of soldiers was. Consequently, the Allied forces, once winter had ended, were in a much better position to end the siege. The centrepiece of the city's defences, Sevastopol's city's defences, was the Balaclava Tower, been rebuilt after the Crimean War. And it was bristling with heavy guns, particularly on the top floor. I think something like 60-pounders and things like that. Impervious to most projectiles fired by the Allies. In the end, the Balaclava Tower was taken by French troops from trenches that had snaked closer and closer to the walls. So it wasn't taken by artillery in the end, it was taken because the French and the British kept digging trenches closer and closer to the walls of Sevastopol and eventually scaled the walls and also this particular bastion. But yeah, I'd have to say at that stage that the Russians were at the end of their tether. They were out of food, ammunition. They were unable to put up much of a defence any longer. Successive assaults beginning in April, the beginning of summer, were mounted after fierce bombardments firing hundreds of thousands of rounds by the Allied troops, now reinforced by 15,000 Sardinian troops. Now, Sardinia decided to send troops because King Victor Emmanuel of Sardinia and his Prime Minister Cavour wanted British and French support when they kicked the Austrians out of Italy and started the Italian Wars of Independence. So as a gesture of goodwill, Sardinians came and fought in the war. The final Russian resistance took place around the Redan Redoubt, a stronghold south of the town. After bitter fighting, it too fell. 3 final assaults in September caused the Russians to withdraw. Sevastopol had fallen. At that point, the war was lost, but several further actions did take place as Russia tried to regain the initiative. Probably the most important was the town of Kars in Armenia, held by the Turks, but was besieged and fell to a Russian army of 25,000 not long after Sevastopol fell. This was in effect the last major action of the war. Nicholas I died in March, and his place was taken by his son Alexander II. Alexander did not have the same commitment to the war. With his father, it was personal, but Alexander was faced with a number of uncomfortable truths. The blockade of the Black Sea and the Gulf of Finland had crippled Russian overseas trade and the Russian economy. The war had cost 145 million UK pounds, which had used up most of the foreign reserves. The human price amounted to some 460,000 military and civilian deaths, a surprising number of civilian deaths. It had become clear that a backward country like Russia was no match for industrialised countries when fighting a modern war. Further, Austria under Franz Joseph had turned against Russia. Austria advised Alexander that unless Russia ended the war, surrendered the Danubian provinces, agreed to free navigation of the Danube, agreed to the Black Sea becoming a neutral zone, gave up claims over the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and agreed to bring any issues of dispute to future European peace conferences, Austria would declare war against him. Sensibly, albeit with reluctance, Alexander agreed, and the peace agreement, the Treaty of Paris, was signed in February 1856. What were the results of the war? The Ottoman Empire continued to totter towards an uncertain future, beset with incompetent government and administrative structures, plagued by corruption and nationalist movements. Some reforms in civil and governments took place, but never enough and always too late. Britain commenced reforming the military, the whole rickety military structure, being ruthlessly exposed to public scrutiny after the war. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 delayed this review, and proper reforms did not occur until 1861. One reform, long overdue, was the provision of proper training for officers through the creation of a military academy and the abolition, at long last, of the sale of commissions. There was a reason for selling a commission. That is, if you were in the army and you were an officer, you didn't get a pension when you retired. So selling a commission was a way of actually raising money to live on. But it had got completely out of hand, where the richest people got the plum jobs, and the plum jobs were the ones that were most important. The French rather rested on their laurels, and the required reforms identified in the Crimean War languished until the Dreyfus affair caused a complete revaluation of the French military in the 1890s. France remained at the cutting edge of new military inventions, although rarely adopting them. The Crimean War was France's only military victory in the 19th century. Alexander II was a reformist, and his assassination in 1881, like Lincoln, set back the process of civil and military reform for decades. He inherited a Russia militarily backward and weakened, and an economy technologically backward and inefficient, and government and administration still completely incompetent and corrupt. He began a process with some success to redress these shortcomings. He restructured the army to reflect what was going on in other European nations, In 1861 he emancipated the serfs. The process was bungled, as was the abolition of slavery in the USA, but that and other civil and economic reforms began to modernise Russia. As an aside, realising Russia could not defend Alaska, settled by Russia in the 18th century, he sold it to the USA in 1867 for an absolute song. I think it was 5.5 cents an acre or something. Even now, in today's money, it's only something like 150 million. So ended the first modern war. It achieved nothing for the participants that proper diplomacy operating in a democratic environment could have resolved, but it did begin the slow transformation of the armies involved to adjust to a new way of doing conflict. The last veteran of the war died in Kew Gardens in 2004. A tortoise called Timothy, she actually was on a pension, had been taken on board the HMS Queen in 1854 as a mascot. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions?
Were the original inhabitants of the Crimean Peninsula not Cossacks? And did they play any role on either side?
No, they didn't. They were recruited by all armies. Most of them evacuated their villages, but if armies of any persuasion got hold of them, they dug trenches and they carried slops, and they did general labouring work. But no, they did not participate in the war. They did not consider themselves Russians, and they certainly resented greatly their villages and towns being destroyed.